Good evening and welcome to everyone. My name is Andrew Cooper and I work at the Tavistock, and I'm going to be chairing this evening's event with help from my colleague Helen Shaw, who you'll meet later, I expect. I'm going to explain the format for the evening and then hand you over briefly to our technical manager for the night, Mike Smith, who will just introduce you to one or two of the technical processes. So the format tonight turns out actually to be quite simple. I'm going to do a very brief introduction in a minute after Mike has talked to you. Helen is going to speak for around 40 to 45 minutes. We're going to take a 10-minute break so that everyone can get a drink or do whatever they need to do. And then in the second half of the evening, we were planning at one point to use breakout rooms, but we can't do it with this number of people. So we're going to stay in a single plenary, and I will be inviting people to offer their comments, their reflections, their experiences, their observations based upon what they've heard in Helen's talk. Not questions. The ethos of these seminars, policy seminars, is that we invite people to think together. Everyone's got a mind, not just the speaker. Now, it's going to be very difficult to get a really inclusive discussion, but we're going to do our very best to enable a kind of connected conversation in that part of the evening. Helen won't participate in that part of the conversation, at least not for a good while. She will rejoin the conversation later on to reflect upon all the observations and reflections that she herself has heard. And then we will close at 9 o'clock. So with that explanation, which I hope was clear, I'm just going to ask Mike to take everyone through the few technicalities we need to attend to.
Thank you very much. I think, to be honest, as always, I'm probably speaking to the people for whom the technology is working, making it a slightly peculiar thing to do. Yeah, so there won't be any chat or anything like that during the first session. So it's just listening only, and then later on we'll be doing the raise hand and unmuting here. So if you can be ready to, if you want to speak and you raise your hand, then be ready for us to ask you to unmute and unmute yourself. But otherwise, if you get kicked off or have extreme technical difficulty, then you can contact me via our email address, which is communications@tavi-port.nhs.uk. And I think that's the sum of it. So, thank you very much.
Maybe before we start the second half, Mike, just take people through exactly how to raise a hand, because maybe not everybody will know, but we can come to that later. Yeah. So thanks very much. Well, I think that the huge interest in tonight's event, Whiteness, a Problem for Our Times, is noteworthy in itself. As a part of the wave of concern, engagement around race relations in our society that the Black Lives Matter movement has mobilized, and on a day today when the chairman of the Football Association in this country has resigned after he referred to Black and Asian players as colored, and in a week, perhaps, when the White House became just a little less white. A focus on whiteness and the psychological and political work that this construct does asks us, white people, to turn our gaze and our capacity for inquiry towards ourselves. This, I think, will be necessarily discomforting, involving what Helen later in her talk refers to as a kind of act of aggression, to try to break through the comfort zone that occupancy of the privileged category of whiteness affords us. So Helen Morgan has been thinking and writing about these matters for many years. She's a Jungian analyst and has led more than one UK psychotherapy organisation in this country in recent years. Her book, The Work of Whiteness, A Psychoanalytic Perspective, is going to be published next year, and a flyer for it is available during this evening's event. That said, I'm going to invite Helen now to talk to us on her theme. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. I have to say this is pretty daunting, sitting in my back room talking to the computer and knowing there are so many people listening. And one of the things that's very difficult to do when you're a speaker in this situation is you get no feedback. So I'd be really encouraging people to use the chat room when it is open, which is after the talk, to put in comments or thoughts, which would be very helpful. It'll be recorded. I'm going to use images throughout, partly so you don't have to look at me for 45 minutes, and partly because I think this subject certainly requires thinking and it requires feelings, but it also requires imagination. And so I've chosen a series of images that I hope will add to the talk, will provoke thought, feelings, responses, and I hope you like them and find them useful. It means you will need to be on speaker view. So I will now go and see whether I can get. Sorry. Oh, where's that gone? Sorry, that's gone to the. Okay. The talk is, as Andrew says, going to last about 45 minutes. I'm dividing this up into 3 parts. The first part, I'm going to talk about the concept of whiteness. And then I'm going to think about how we learn whiteness. And then the third part, I want to look at what I think the work of whiteness is to be if we are to make any changes. So, the concept of whiteness as applied to humans is full of paradox and contradiction. No human being, even the fairest amongst us, has skin that is actually white, just as the darkest is not black. Yet this crude form of colour coding, which came into being in the modern era, has divided humanity and ensured white supremacy in the service of domination, colonialism, slavery, and capitalism. The deliberate use of this division for political and economic advantage was first recorded in 17th century Virginia, when the first Africans were forcibly brought on slave ships to work the plantations. Anxious that the indentured European labour force would find common cause with the enslaved Africans, the term white was used to transform the masters, plantation owners, and European labourers into one all-inclusive group. Through a set of laws that privileged whites alone, any class solidarity with the blacks was disrupted, ensuring that power remained in the hands of the ruling white elite. Gathering all those with lighter hued skin under the rubric white in the emergent piecemeal way that this occurred, not only allowed the illusion of common privilege, but also tapped into our unconscious imaginary in relation to white and to black. These associations, albeit with some local variations, tend to be universal, based as they are on the nature of our bodies and the diurnal rhythms of the planet we inhabit. Mother's nourishing milk and father's productive sperm are white, bile and shit are black or brown. White is associated with daytime, the dove of peace and the pure soul, whereas black belongs to the dark terrors of night, to war and sin. Devils inhabit the darkness of hell and angels the whiteness of heaven. Link those with a lighter hue of skin to whiteness and the others to blackness, and much of the psychological work of the justifying domination is done. Whiteness implies purity and allows no contamination, no tincture, or it ceases to be white. We are whitewashed, drained of our colours, and all imperfections are located elsewhere. The creation of whiteness forces blackness into existence and turns distinctions as shades into oppositions. Since white cannot allow darkness to exist within itself, shadows must be rejected and cast into what it deems to be black. In the words of James Hillman, white casts its own white shadow. This conclusion may be better to say, white sees its own shadow in black, not because they are inherently opposite, but it is archetypically given to whiteness to imagine in oppositions. The category of whiteness, like that of blackness, includes within it an infinite variety of lived experiences of and relationships to the concept. The line that is drawn separating the two has shifted across history and geography, leaving behind a variety of legacies. Many here today will have ancestors who themselves were oppressed and discriminated against. A person of Irish, Southern European, or Latin American descent, or those who are Jewish, Muslim, or from minority religious groups, will have their own historic background of suffering and oppression. Indeed, there have been periods in times and places when each of these groups have been designated as non-white or black. Those who have grown up in societies with a colonial history carrying a different collective cultural shadow than those who haven't. The existence of the plantation and of institutionalized chattel slavery for several hundred years in the Americas leaves a different legacy than that inherited by the descendants of the European men who ran the trade. Few of us trace a direct hereditary line back to slavers, yet here in the UK we live our lives amongst the concrete legacy and profits of that trade. There are also political and ethical differences within the white group. Some will experience discrimination now on the basis of gender, class, sexuality, language, disability, etc. These personal histories and experiences are important and to be honoured, and it is for each individual to find their own relationship to their ancestors and to their life story. And yet, whatever our personal history, wherever we were born, into which class, however young or old we are, if we walk the world as white, we inherit a privilege denied those regarded as black. We may have to bear the discrimination due to our class or sexuality or gender or disability, but we do so without the added burden of racism. We do not fear the forces of law and order in the way a black person does. Doors are not closed to us because of our skin colour. We see ourselves reflected in places of power and influence and can take for granted a basic social justice across all our institutions, from health to education to the law. We may, if we wish, remain disinterested in racism itself, and we have the choice to ignore or even deny its presence in the world we inhabit. Facing the implications of being white is not comfortable, and we can seek ways of delinking ourselves from this phenomenon, often through a form of exceptionalism. I echo Robin DiAngelo's plea in her book on white fragility, that when we face our whiteness, we need to set aside our sense of uniqueness. This, she says, is a critical skill that will allow you to see the big picture of the society in which we live. Individualism will not. For now, try to let go of your individual narrative and grapple with the collective messages we all receive as members of a larger shared culture. Work to see how these messages have shaped your life, rather than use some aspect of your story to excuse yourself from their impact. It can be argued that the very use of the concepts white and black is a way of perpetuating a false binary, and they need to be dropped. It would indeed be a great achievement if we were to reach a point where such terms became meaningless. In the meantime, I argue that to deny the terms is to deny the reality of a form of classification and injustice which needs to be faced at an individual and collective level if we are to get anywhere with creating a fairer, kinder society. Such a denial offers a shortcut that avoids such work and reflects and reinforces the tendency we white people have to not see either our whiteness or our racism, perhaps best summarized as a colorblind position. From the evidence that has emerged from the analysis of DNA, it is now clear that the term race is a constructed concept with no objective basis in biology. The division of the races was created for economic and political purposes, and it is a deep, entrenched social structure which creates and promotes white privilege and is one within which we all live. No one can be free from it. The statement, "I am not a racist," is meaningless in such a system. This awareness of the deeply embedded aspect of the racist system is essential if we are to get anywhere with understanding and changing it. Linda Olkoff writes, "Whiteness is lived and not merely represented. It is a prominent feature of one's way of being in the world, of how one navigates that world, and how one is navigated around by others." She goes on to suggest that we tend to reject group concepts in order to maintain the idea that we have control over our identity. She says, being identified in a way that lies beyond our individual control conflicts with individualist ideas and illusions about our autonomy. The real concern with race may be less the faulty presumptions about genetic difference than the fact that this is a social fact about us with social meanings and implications over which we have limited agency. People of colour have largely come to accept this. For whites, the forcible interpolations of their racial identity are more often a new experience. As Adrienne Harris puts it, to turn to a deconstruction of whiteness is to make the unremarkable remarkable, to force unexamined assumptions, to open up a set of questions. The goal, of course, is to see whiteness as a social construction, to see that whiteness is the unmarked category, and in that particular way accrues and hoards power. Psychoanalytic understandings of how racism operates, focusing as they do on the dynamics of splitting, projection, and interjection, whilst useful to an extent, tend to reinforce the individualism that liberal white people prefer, as Olkoff describes. We are more comfortable thinking in terms of the individual racist act, which we can then condemn and dissociate ourselves from. In his explorations of the archetypal uses of whiteness, Hillman points out that the concept also implies attributes that are not so positive. White also represents what is ashen, pallid, colourless, blank, lily-livered, cowardly. He writes of white as but a blank and ignorant page, the requisite stupidity at the start. The philosopher Charles Mill refers to the inverted epistemology he calls white ignorance, which he suggests produces the ironic outcome that whites will in general be unable to understand the world they themselves have made. Olkoff describes the concept as a set of substantive epistemic practices designed to protect their belief that society is basically a meritocracy, people of colour are responsible for their troubles, and racism is a thing of the past. Just as D'Angelo stresses that white fragility is not a weakness, but a way of protecting white privilege, white ignorance is the means by which we at the centre close our eyes to our privilege and the impact on those at the margins. By staying blind and unknowing, by assuming racism, disparity, and prejudice belong to the past or to other individuals within modern day society, we manage the tightrope of relieving ourselves of guilt while ensuring the advantages of our whiteness are maintained. We, who I refer to as white liberals, can dwell in this ignorance. Our racism is of a cordial variety, which conceals the violence within, which we project onto avowed white supremacists, failing to see how we are linked. Martin Luther King wrote, "I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's greatest stumbling block in his strike towards freedom is not the white citizens' councillor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice. The ugliness of racism can only be challenged by white people facing the injustice of this system and recognizing that we will have to relinquish in ensuring a healthy society. My argument is that we too have much to gain in doing so. Liberal is not only an ironic term, but includes within it a longing for justice and equality, and it is those instincts we need to call upon. As Cavell writes, racism, which diminishes its object to non-human status, also diminishes its perpetrator. All are losers by its term. It does so in the final analysis by diminishing life, by reducing it to an abstraction, the better to manage it historically. And racism thereby becomes part of the wider system of man's compact with the natural world in which he finds himself. When we white folk choose to stay blind, deaf and silent concerning our own privilege and its impact on the black other, we are opting to remain unconscious of a crucial aspect of our lives and ourselves. This part of our shadow has been whitewashed out of view, but then what colours, what potential, what depths might we be missing? Given this, why do we persist in tolerating this lack, which seems so central to whiteness? How do we manage so effectively to persevere in not seeing the implications for the society of which we are citizens? Why do we continue so doggedly with our ignorance? The tenacity of the problem suggests the political and the social has developed roots deep into the individual psyche, and it made me wonder how the baby who is born pink learns to become white. Recent research, mainly in the US, but also in Europe, shows that children recognize both the fact of difference and the inherent privilege in whiteness far earlier than is usually thought. In 1992, Troyner and Hatcher studied children in predominantly white primary schools in Britain. They found that race is a significant element in the lives of black and white children, both in their social relationships and in their understanding of society. This is the case even where the black children are in a small minority. In 2003, Phyllis Katz held a longitudinal study which followed 100 African American children and 100 European American children for their first 6 years. When children were 3, they were shown photographs of other children and asked them to choose whom they would like to have as friends. Of the white group, 86% picked other white children. When they were between 5 and 6, Katz gave these children a small deck of cards with drawings of people on them. Katz asked the children to sort the cards into 2 piles any way they wanted. Whereas only 16% split the piles on the basis of gender, 68% did so on the basis of race. Van Alsdal and Fegan studied 3 to 6-year-olds in an American urban nursery school using an observational research method. They found that children learned to identify racial or ethnic markers such as skin color and use them to gain social control, although such activities were curbed when adults are present. They write, children in this society learn at an early age that generally speaking, whiteness is privileged and darkness is not, and thus their choices in this regard are usually not surprising. Despite the fact that they only observed and recorded what occurred between children, Van Alsdal and Fegan experienced some hostility from white parents regarding their findings. They say when most adults are confronted with evidence that 3-year-olds are masters at managing racial ethnic relations, they often become disturbed, try to rationalize the evidence away, or dismiss our evidence as unique. They go on to say, this failure to acknowledge the importance of racial groups in children's lives arises from the twin adult convictions that children are naive and that colorblindness is not only desirable but achievable. Frankly put, many white adults insist that racial distinctions do not matter, while all around them children see ample and compelling evidence that they do matter, and matter very much indeed. One practical response to this ideological contradiction by white children is to conceal the creation of their own racial understandings and relationships, at least while the prying eyes of adults are on them. This enables them to reproduce the racial ethnic hierarchy in their own relationships without interference from adults. The following is an example from their observational study in the daycare centre. This is of Van Worsdel and Fegan. In this instance, Renee, who's 4 and white, is pulling Ling Mai, who's 3 and Asian, and Jocelyn, who's 4.5 and also white, across the playground in a wagon. Renee tugs away enthusiastically, but the task is difficult. Pulling this heavy load across loose dirt is more than Renee can handle. Suddenly she drops the handle, which falls to the ground, and stands still, breathing heavily. Ling Mai, eager to continue this game, jumps from the wagon and picks up the handle. As Ling Mai begins to pull, Renee admonishes her. No, no, you can't pull this wagon. Only white Americans can pull this wagon. Renee has her hands on her lips and frowns at Ling Mai. The Asian girl tries again to lift the handle of the wagon, and Renee again insists that only white Americans are permitted to do these tasks. This is the breaking point, and adult intervention is now sought. Ling Mai sobs loudly and runs to a nearby teacher, complaining that Renee hurt my feelings. We see the child's discretion at work. She offers no more than hurt feelings to explain her actions to the teacher. Since intervention is in order, the teacher approaches Renee. Did you hurt Ling Mai's feelings? The teacher asks Renee, who glumly nods assent. This is a familiar ritual. I think you should apologize, the teacher continues, because we are all friends here, and friends don't hurt each other's feelings. Sorry, mutters Renee, not looking at Ling Mai. I didn't do it on purpose. Ling Mai stands silently. The teacher waits for a few minutes, then finishes with, okay, can you guys be good friends now? Both girls nod without looking at each other and quickly move away. The teacher stands and waits for a moment or two to assure herself that the conflict does not erupt again, then moves off. Both Renee and Ling Mai have already worked out that racial identity and colour have powerful implications in social relations, and both recognise that Renee's words and actions are hurtful. However, both also seem to realise that the factor of race needs to be kept away from any involvement of an adult. Ling Mai did not reveal to the teacher that race was involved in the dispute, even though that would have got Renee into a lot more trouble, and in one sense, Ling Mai would have triumphed. But she may well have enough experience of how white power operates to know that a temporary gain might not be worth longer-term punishment. Thus, whilst Renee has to apologise, her position is not challenged and indeed is confirmed for both of them. The common understanding of how children develop race awareness is that it is a bottom-up process, whereby the child notices physical differences between themselves and others, then hears derogatory comments about those who have a darker skin. Lauren Hirschfield confronts this perception, positing instead that the process is more one that is top-down. He says the young child does not learn about race in isolation, but learns about race in the more global task of parsing the social world. This consists of attending to information that is relevant to the scope of the social groups that exist in the world. He goes on to say, given all this, it makes sense that young children adopt a top-down approach to acquiring information about the prevailing social ontology, relying on a learning strategy that focuses attention on the logic of the system, rather than worrying the details of individual identification. The child acquiring knowledge of race is in the business of acquiring knowledge of the kinds of things of which society is composed, not a catalogue of corporal variation. The child growing up in a white liberal family comes to recognize that they are white and that there are black others, not so privileged, without necessarily being clear about what physical characteristics are pertinent to either category. They are socialized into a world of white solipsism, where apart from the occasional exception, it is whites who are given the significant and interesting roles, while blacks are more often relegated to those of service, sport, music, or crime. Children need help to think about what they observe about the racist structures of society and to connect their inherited privilege with a developing concern for fairness. They need a language for thought from which effective action can develop. However, many white adults become embarrassed, hush the child, ignore or distract them, or resort to the shortcut of colorblindness by insisting that everyone is the same and equal. Such an assertion is not only untrue and denies what the child has observed and experienced. By focusing on the universality of humans, the message is conveyed that it is the recognition of difference that is the cause of racism, rather than the fact that the child has been born into a social system that discriminates against certain groups, which they need help to acknowledge, understand, and begin to think through how they might respond. 4-year-old Renee had already grasped that there are groups within society who have power and privilege, and there were those who do not. She may not understand what the concepts white and American mean, but she does recognize that they can be used to exclude. She is incorporating whiteness as part of her identity and knows that this identity gives her power over the racial other. And most important, she acts on her understandings. The critical issue of group membership figures strongly in this instant. Renee has also learned that this knowledge has to be kept secret from adults. When one knows something and yet all the messages from important adults are that it shouldn't be known, the psyche has to repudiate some or all of the meaning of reality. Internally, two conflicting situations develop. In order that they can coexist, a vertical split is created within the psyche. This split is reflected in and reinforced by the wider social system, allowing both the reality of white privilege and its disavowal. In psychoanalytic theory, an internal conflict may lead to the creation of horizontal splits in the psyche, where aspects of the self are repressed, made unconscious, and denied. Outside of conscious awareness, these repressed elements of the psyche can have a damaging and conflictual impact on the individual's life and relationships. Whilst also a defensive process, disavowal develops within the ego when it is faced with two conflicting realities, causing a vertical split. Unlike repression, the individual remains conscious of both sides of the split, but will disavow either to meet internal desires and needs or minimize anxiety. Thus, I can know the reality of the consequences of my behavior, but will disregard that awareness in order to satisfy my desires, my omnipotence, and my narcissistic sense of entitlement. Disavowal features strongly in addiction, where the person is fully aware of the consequences of continuing their behavior, an awareness that would be put aside and ignored in the service of meeting the need for the drug of choice. It can be seen operating collectively and individuals in relation to the climate emergency. The liberal narrative, which exacerbated perhaps by the purity that is embedded in the very notion of whiteness, abjures the realities of racism whilst also needing to maintain the privilege of the white skin. Thus, the white individual and the white collective has to maintain both white privilege and an acceptable perception of the self. The tension between these two positions is solved by disavowal. I suggest this vertical split as it relates to racism is not merely a single line dividing two parts of the psyche, with the investment in white privilege and the racist thought on one side, and the condemnation and rejection of racism on the other. On both sides, there remains a capacity for symbolization, which is lacking in certain moments when we are reminded of our racism. The internal psychic structure can be imagined as made up of two vertical layers between which there is a gap, a silent, empty place devoid of symbols in which it is impossible to play or grieve. Adrienne Harris states, "It may be that there is in whiteness a psychose blanche, named by Andre Green for quite other purposes. Deeper than depression, deeper than rage, there is a blankness, a place where there is not sufficient structure for mourning, where the psyche gives way. Perhaps this is what whiteness is, the disruption or erasure of mourning, a gap in the psyche which through whiteness functions like an imploding star, refusing signification. It is not trauma solely that is whitened out, but also destructiveness and memory." In most other aspects of her or his life, the white child in a modern liberal family can take their curiosity regarding the social milieu they seek to understand and find their place within to the significant adults in their life. For the majority of the time, their experience will be of lively engagement, attention, and interest. When they raise the matter of differences concerning race and ethnicity, and they are responded to with the sterility of a blanket colorblind position, the lively, engaged presence they had known previously disappears, and they are faced with a blankness, a shutting down, and a silencing. There is a deadness which relates to the subject, and the child quickly learns that the topic is not welcome for discussion. Their curiosity and developing concern for others, their preoccupation with the troubled matter of social fairness, is shut down, and the vertical split of disavowal develops within the psyche. As Katz points out, children who develop in this way are robbed of opportunities for emotional and intellectual growth, stunted in the basic development of the self, so they cannot experience or accept humanity. This is a personality outcome in which it is quite possible to build into children a great feeling and compassion for animals and an unconscious fear and rejection of differing human beings. Such persons are by no means prepared to live and move with either appreciation or effectiveness in today's world. Black parents will be far more alert to the fact of racism and the dominance of whiteness in the society in which their children are growing up, and will have to respond to and help reframe their children's experiences. In 2007, a study of 17,000 American families with preschool children found that non-white parents are about 3 times more likely to discuss race with their children than white parents, 75% of whom never or almost never talk about race. White parents may feel they don't have to engage with the subject, and indeed may feel uncomfortable in doing so. Both the confidence and sense of entitlement that comes with inhabiting a world which reflects you and your life, as well as a contract of silence about the disparities, is passed on from parent to child. Ryan Parker writes, "A critical component of these processes of disavowal are the ways that white children learn to disconnect, to stop thinking, to stop noticing, to stop linking reality and history, and to turn off their empathic curiosity and care. If allowed to develop, this curiosity and care would cause problems for whiteness's power and the privileges it claims and protects. But it would result in recognition of reality, which eventually might lead to responsibility taking and reparation." A few years back, I was presenting a paper on racism to an all-white group of therapists. A difficult and uncomfortable discussion followed, in which the group seemed collectively engaged in finding ways to avoid the emotional work of exploring their own racism. These included individuals separating themselves from the white group by asserting a different nationality, language, history, class, or age. Questions were asked as to why we were not focusing on sexuality, gender, class, or disability. All important subjects, but not the topic of the day. As it always does, the introduction of these other inequalities managed to flatten the discussion, so the subject of racism was in danger of disappearing altogether. Someone pointed out that Black people are racist too, managing to evade the critical matter of power differentials. The hostility towards me as the person raising the subject was palpable. It was a depressing but very familiar event. After some time, a woman who'd been silent till then said she was thinking about an experience on her way to the seminar that day. She was waiting in her car at some traffic lights and another car pulled up beside her, driven by a woman dressed in a burqa. Looking across, the thought came to her, oh, so they can drive, can they? She instantly pushed the thought away as she was aware of the racism behind it. She'd been turning the memory over in her mind throughout the discussion. As someone who usually experienced no difficulty in speaking in groups, she felt she was puzzled by what felt like a profound reluctance to bring this thought into the discussion. She recognized her own internal condemnation of the prejudice tied up in the thought, as well as the fear of external attack were she to give it voice. By recounting her thought to the group, who until then were firmly on the I am not a racist side of the vertical split, she articulated a reality from the other side. In my experience, three main possibilities were then open to the group. The first was to isolate and scapegoat the individual, so she carried alone all the guilt of having racist thoughts. The second was to normalize her response and wipe it clean of any racism, thus bringing her over to their side of the divide. The third, which fortunately was what happened in this particular group, is for her courage to give permission for others to recall similar instances in their own lives. The atmosphere shifted, the anxiety and the defensiveness became less intense, and the level of communication deepened. There emerged the chance of ownership of just a little of the destructiveness of our racism, allowing the possibilities of grief. The dynamic played itself out in a group of individuals, but it might also be seen as an illustration of what occurs inside the psyche. Racist thoughts will arise in our mind, but they are likely to be quickly dismissed or even forgotten. This process of disavowal may mean we can preserve an internal sense of ourselves as good, but it perpetuates the ignorance that is such a central aspect of the maintenance of our white privilege and ensures nothing changes. As in the group, if the thought is surfaced and allowed, it becomes available for examination, and we deepen our understanding of how this social fact of whiteness affects and distorts our relationship to others in the world and to ourselves. Robin DiAngelo puts it thus: to increase the racial stamina that counters white fragility, we must reflect on the whole of our identities and our racial group identity in particular. For white people, this means first struggling with what it means to be white. Adrian Harris writes, what is ironic and infuriating to many contemporary people of colour writing about racism is that the revelations and analysis of continuing racism by people of colour is not leading to work within the white community. I use the word work deliberately to mean the hard but necessary intellectual and emotional labour that will be essential to transform and unpack racism as it is lived and enacted among white persons. This is a way of suggesting that reparations, forgiveness, work across racial lines requires first work within white communities and individuals. Christina Sharp's powerfully moving book, In the Wake, on Blackness and Being, takes the three meanings of the word wake. One, the track left on the water surface by a ship. Second, a watch or vigil held beside the body of someone who has died. And three, the state of wakefulness, consciousness. Weaving in her personal history with film, photography, and art, she uses these meanings as a way of thinking in a contemplation of how Black people live with the aftermath of slavery and the racism of the modern world. She contemplates the wake that was created as the slave ship journeyed from Africa to the Americas and the impunity with which enslaved Africans who were ill or weak or rebellious were thrown overboard. She expands the concept as a metaphor for the consideration of the suffering of Black people who lives their lives in the wake of the trade. Recovery requires mourning and what she calls wake work. Sharp, of course, is concerned with the disturbance that follows the centuries of slavery for Black people living today. But reading this impressive work, I found myself wondering if and how the concept might apply to whiteness. Our relationship to this painful history is very different, and so therefore is the work required. We who are descendants of the white people who sailed those ships, who invested in the trade, who profited from the trade, that is to say, all white people, need also to address our past. The whiteness of the waves created by the ships soon disappear. The waters close over the Black African bodies and flat calm restored. For the white bystander, no permanent visible scar remains. The ships may have passed, but without justice, without reparation, without collective grieving and the eradication of racism, the trauma of those times continues to be held in the generations of Black descendants. White ancestral history, the role of the perpetrators, the impact on the victims, as well as the extent to which we profited and continue to profit, demands recognition. This history should be central into the curricula taught to all our children, but for those of us whose education touched only lightly on the matter, it is our responsibility to educate ourselves now as adults. The second meaning of the term wake refers to its place in the process of mourning. We keep watch with the dead and grieve their passing. A wake is traditionally a collective activity which acknowledges that the death of one affects the whole. These are essential communal rituals, especially when a death is the result of a collective failure. For without them, the undigested, unmourned suffering of previous generations are passed down from generation to generation as phantom narratives that pervade our personal and social lives. For Black people who are the direct descendants of the enslaved, the grief is great. The idea that white people too need to mourn might seem odd, given that we have gained so much and apparently lost so little in the history of race. As we face the guilt of whiteness past and present, we have to let go of the myth of our white innocence and purity and not acknowledge the darkness at its heart. The privilege paid for by the blood of others has a toxicity at its root which corrupts the psyche. Terrible damage has been done and will continue to be done if we are to go on basing our economic and political ways of being on racist structures. Only by facing the pain and the guilt of the ancestors and of our inheritance, only by keeping vigil, can we come anywhere near to laying the iniquities of slavery to rest. This brings us to the third meaning of the term wake, which is to wake up to the way the world is structured and to our personal part in it. For white people, this means a lifelong process of active commitment to examine and confront both internal and external activities that are based in prejudice and stereotypes, which depersonalize and do harm to the Black other. It means listening with care when Black friends and colleagues tell us of their troubles without rushing to a defense of ourselves. It requires us to face our white fragility head on, engage in conversations even though we risk getting it wrong. And when we do, we need to listen openly to understand how our words have caused hurt. We need to develop our resilience and challenge our fragile state. It demands a careful attention to the thoughts and responses that arise in the mind, because their exploration will help us see how the system of racism within which we live expresses ourselves in our minds. Because this system is based in our favor and privileges us, because part of that privilege is the invisibility of our whiteness, taking on this work requires us to make active, determined and ongoing choices. The fragility in whiteness that maintains that privilege keeps pulling us away from the discomfort that is inevitable if we are to fully engage in that exploration. We are required to build a stamina and a resilience in speaking about the subject if we are to genuinely support anti-racist activities. As he was walking to his London studio one day in the 1960s, the Guyanese artist Frank Bowling came across a large white spot swan trapped in a pool of oil from which it was struggling to fly free. Struck by the ferocious determination of the bird, Bowling painted sufficient versions of the image to fill the first room of the retrospective of his work at Tate Britain. As I stood before the canvas in the summer of 2019, I was struck by this picture of whiteness, caught as it was by the consequences of exploitation. I saw within it something of the terrible damage done by whiteness since its inception in the 17th century, in its corruption of human relations between each other and with this planet. Having to bear continual acts of racism, both extreme and subtle, is what the Black individual has to suffer and is the price they pay for my privilege. But it harms us all, and if I want to live in a world that it is not divided, is not contaminated with the psychopathology of racism, where we re-find our connections, then I must acknowledge that this covenant of whiteness is my inheritance. Then I must decide what it means, what it costs, and whether I'm prepared to give it up. But I, for one, want my colour back. Thank you.
So, Helen, thank you very, very much indeed. So much to think about, which is what I'm sure people are doing and what we can continue to do out loud after the break. So we're going to take a break now and for 10 minutes, and I'll be restarting the event at 8:05. So please reconvene then. Meanwhile, the chat will be enabled and you can begin to post reflections, thoughts, responses in the chat. But when we return, we will be using the raise hand function to request to speak. And I will be attempting to create some sort of connected conversation. But for now, thank you once again, Helen, and let's take a break and reconvene in 10 minutes. Thank you, and people are showing their appreciation, I think. The discussion phase of tonight underway now. As Mike has said, the procedure is that if you want to speak, please use the raise hand function, which is just spoken about. And the first person I can see who has raised their hand is called Konya. So I'm going to unmute Konya. I don't know where you are. And please speak.
Hello, I was just about to send you a message, Andrew. It's Sonia here. My colleague was thrown outside of this training. I'm just sending you a message just to you. And obviously I was trying to get in touch during the break, but it wasn't possible. I'm so sorry, it's not related to the context of training, but somebody couldn't come back into the training. So the question is, will we be able to actually access the recording? And will you be able to send it to everybody who might have not been able to return into the training after being gone?
Into the event. Mike, I'm not sure what the plans are for making the recording available.
Yes, short answer, we are recording this, and yep, our hope is to put it up. We're obviously running a whole suite of centenary events to celebrate 100 years of the Tavistock on Portman, and we're having to gather this all together. So we'll be hopefully promoting it through social media and that kind of stuff, and can send it to the entire attendee list through Eventbrite. It might take a few days to process and get up there, but yes, we will send it out to you all.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So, would anybody else like to make a contribution to get the discussion underway, please? As I say, so I've got Eve.
Hello, my name's Ev. I'm actually in the United States. I was just listening to the presentation and I thought how interesting and helpful and beneficial it is. I'm Black Latina, and my father is the one who is Black, born in Costa Rica, came to the United States, married my mother, all of that. And it's really interesting the dynamic we have because I actually was not raised to believe that I was Black. So I was very confused. I wanted to be white. I knew I had Black features. I actually had a moment in my life where I hated my dad for being Black. But as I've grown up, I've learned, educated, all of these things. And it's so interesting to see how with my education, we come in conflict so much because he has so much internal racism embedded inside of him. So I'll talk to him about issues with like Black Lives Matter and like different issues that we have within the Black community here in the US. I'm a social worker, so I tend to like have a little bit more information in that area. So we'll have this conversation and the conflict is so intense because of the lack of like knowledge that exists and if you don't do your own personal research on being Black, you just don't know you don't know our history. And on top of that, I see how whitewashed Christianity and Eurocentric Christianity has impacted the way he views issues like racism and all of that. And so I just was thinking like, how wonderful would it be or how impactful would it be for my father to hear this coming from a white person who he sees as like a good person and a very helpful person and people who are generous. I'm not sure if I'm making any sense, but yeah.
I think you're making complete sense. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to move on to Jane Johnson. I'm trying to unmute. Yeah, there we go.
You're muted, Jane.
Yeah, got it. Okay. Just want to share an experience I had when I was listening to Helen, but also looking at the images. And I was so struck. I mean, so many people have commented on the work and the profound nature of what Helen has been speaking about, but I was very struck by the images and the work that's gone into them and the silent work that was going on in the background as these images came in front of me. And it connects to the idea of the vertical split and then this gap, which is devoid of symbols. I found that such a useful idea. And what most struck me was the image, or most disturbed me actually, was the image of the Black man carrying the angry white man on his shoulders. Because when I first saw it, I thought, I cannot make sense of this. This is the wrong way round. This should be a white policeman carrying an angry Black man. That was what was going through my mind. And it really woke me up to something that shocked me really, about some assumptions that I was making. And so there's something so powerful about the images and what can be evoked. Thank you for those.
Thank you very much. Both of you have been very concise, succinct so far, and I'd like to encourage that, please, to say what you like, but we need to allow people time to speak. So I'm coming now to Gurnam Singh.
Hello, thank you, Helen, for your fantastic presentation, first of all. I just wanted to really pick up a couple of points very briefly. One kind of links with what Ev said, and that's that whiteness isn't just deployed by so-called white people. It's also deployed by non-white people. And so we need to develop some insights into that. I mean, a bit like what Ev was saying, but also if you look at, say, China or India, parts of Africa, whiteness is deployed extensively there as a symbol of superiority. So we need to find out what's going on there, I think. And secondly, I've been reading some stuff around this notion that black and white is a false binary. And that if you look within the European Enlightenment tradition, the binary was never black, white and black, it was human and black. And so we need to see how whiteness, in a sense, becomes synonymous with being human. And if that's the case, how do you escape that? Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. So I'm coming now to Esther S.
Thank you. I have to say this talk was refreshing. I guess for me, when I saw it, I wasn't sure. I was apprehensive. And what I have to say, Helen, is that what you did so well was to talk about the intersecting factors that relate. So you went all the way back to the 17th, talking about kind of the actually how there's no such thing as talking about actually the shades that began and talking about slavery, and actually intersecting that with kind of political, economic, social, all these factors that actually interlink to what we see in today in terms of racism. I also think what was really nice to hear was also about the way in which when talked about racism and whiteness, the uncomfortableness and actually the defenses that people then employ. And actually just going back to what the gentleman said, the reason why in a lot of these countries, there's still this idea of white superiority is because of slavery and colonialism, which still exists. So when you think about caste system, these are all factors that Helen has pointed to. And I think it was really nice to hear from a white person actually how all these intersect, because a lot of the time when you hear these conversations is a microcosm. And I think also it's important that those who work in the helping profession also think about the way in which they continue to perpetuate some of these, and this idea that actually, well, I'm slightly different because I work in the helping profession and therefore I can't be racist, I can't be X, Y, and Z. So thank you so much for that. It was honestly really refreshing. I can't wait to read your book. I can't wait to put in my thesis. Thank you.
I just wonder whether I think we probably understand, but could you say just a little bit about what your apprehension was about?
Yes, so for me, it's this idea that what you tend to see in society is that with white people, they feel like they are the kind of, what's the word? They are the kind of, basically the sense that they know better than Black people, that they are the, you know, you hear it in literature, you hear it in, it's like, well, Black people are this, or in crime, they kind of have this idea that they know what's going on and they tend to speak on behalf of Black people or other ethnic minorities and fail to talk about these intersecting factors. And even you hear it in the media and the way things are perpetrated. So for example, Kamala Harris is a perfect example. Now she's done really well, but the reality that it's this idea that, oh, everyone can achieve this standard of her. But actually, if you look furthermore, you might look at the facts of the way she was raised, the school she went to, this idea that actually because she made it to the top that everyone can, and that's not the reality. And I think you also speak about that, Helen, with that the fact of actually for certain things there's actually a reality to it, and actually for Black people we're not a monolithic race, so there's various intersecting factors that lead to all our experiences are different. And so for me it's just this idea of, oh great, what is this white person going to say? She's going to act like she knows what she's coming from, or like, oh, because she's an academic or a lecturer, or whatever it is, she knows better, and then therefore she's going to speak on behalf and miss out all these factors that actually influences people's experiences. But Helen didn't do that, and yeah, it's really great to hear and see. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm coming now to Dan.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi. I'm just sort of trying to build on your thing you were saying about reflections and what I can bring from my own experience. I'm trying to think about things that rub me up the wrong way. I think in England, especially as an English person, sometimes the racism might not be as in your face or confrontational, but there's a lot of things like devils in the details. And when I used to be a teacher in secondary school, something that rubbed me up a bit odd. When you look on the registers, it actually says the nationality, sort of the races and nationalities of the students, which firstly is a bit odd when you see that for the first time. But I noticed that it's also white British, and I found that quite odd that you can link whiteness with nationality. And I noticed, there's no black British or, brown British, whatever, are those things even possible? And I find that a bit odd that we still have that on the registers in every single school in this country, the phrase white British. I find that very odd. And I just thought that really rubbed me up the wrong way. Now I think about it, it's very strange to me. That's what I'd say, really.
Okay, thank you. So much to think about there. So next I'm coming to Deirdre.
Oh, hello. I really wanted to thank Helen for the talk. There were quite a few things that leapt out at me, and particularly the stuff around children. And sorry, as a white mother of mixed race daughter, she's in her teens now. Most of her life I've gone, oh, I mean, unpleasant to say, but I've gone, race doesn't really seem to be that much of an issue. That's, being real about where I've come from. We've had some conversations, but it's only been the focus on Black Lives Matter this year that's brought things to a head for me more. As we've had more frank discussions, and I've been looking at what it is to have been colourblind and how unhelpful that is for her as a young woman of colour, a brown woman as she calls herself often. And I was sort of deconstructing some of it. So it's the stuff around, well, it's polite to kind of be colourblind, has been the, a previous way of being. And so it's helpful to kind of to be looking at how that's part of the way of a white perpetuating of systemic racism. And that's been new concepts for me this year. And it's been really important. And it was very helpful to look at how, the journey of children and how adults, white adults in particular, are shielded and make sure that we don't see what's going on. And I just wish my kids were younger, but, to have made it more of a difference to her and to her peers as they were growing up. I also find it particularly helpful as well in this setup that you pointed again about the white liberal perspective of racism being bad individuals or individual acts rather than this wider system that we benefit from deeply. So just thank you. I thought I'd share those.
Okay, well, thank you very, very much. I'm coming now to Brito. I'm trying to unmute. I'm not successfully. Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Can you
there
hear
we
me
go.
now? Oh, sorry. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Helen, for your wonderful analysis. All through your talk, I could apply the talk to myself and my discomfort. I'm a practicing psychotherapist, arts therapist, as well as a Catholic priest. For 20 years, I've been in this country. I'm in London, I'm not in UK, I'm not in India. I have an Indian background. But your talk helped me to understand the source of my discomfort. For example, one point is that I'm afraid to speak out my own better self, and it's better to act foolish or stupid rather than seeming to be intelligent, whatever that is. So there is that institutional racism, and it helped me to understand the whiteness within even institutional church. So that by way of thanking you as to how your talk helped me to understand my own fellow white priests. But the question I wish to ask you is how do you analyze the Trump phenomena and white supremacists, especially in the United States, since this is a white elephant, sorry, call it a white elephant in the room, and we cannot but comment. I'd like you to comment, like how does how do you see the splitting, whether it be vertical splitting, horizontal splitting? How do you apply the concept of splitting to the Trump phenomena? I hope my question is quite direct. And to add more complexity to my own comment on Kamala Harris, it's very complex. How does Kamala Harris view herself? Because Kamala, coming from India, comes from the Brahmin community. That's on one generation. But nobody's talking enough of the Jamaican, yet possibly she may talk about a missing Jamaican father. But within the Indian psyche, the Brahmin community is more white than whites. That's any caste struggle person in India, the Dalit will say that straight away. So most Indians, especially from the social analysis, will look at it that way. But within herself, she has so much of complexity, and possibly there is whiteness in her too. This is not negative, but just to add to the complexity of white, black are not two separate categories, but there is a white in the black, there's a black in the white, just to pass my own comment for others to comment more upon.
So thank you. We don't take questions to the speaker in the usual way, but your questions are good. Other people may want to pick up on them and have a think about the Trump phenomenon and splitting and whiteness and so forth. But I'm coming now to Diana Bass.
Thank you, Andrew.
All right, it's sticky, this function.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Helen, for a really wonderful talk. I was thinking about what Ev said and thinking about internalized oppression, which is really powerful and long lasting. And also Gunram, I think, sorry, I probably haven't got your name quite right, but about the dehumanization in racism, that actually the profound driver of, to keep difference different is to dehumanize. And growing up in South Africa, I am very aware of that. So I am a bit concerned about silos, about white people having to do their white work on their own, and Black people being in groups talking about their struggles. I really think that any move forward comes from dialogue and relationship and actually opening ourselves up to the people we work with or we know or socialize with is, to me, where the change comes, because that's where the dehumanization stops, when we see others as human beings, full human beings like us. We can't anymore go with systemic racism, because the deserved shame is what we need to feel that takes us forward of our privilege, but actually it's a systemic shame. And at that point we disavow our feelings because we see it as our individual shame. But actually, if we can think about it as systemic, we can start to become more curious about it and the dismantling of it. So yeah, I wanted to thank Helen, and also really powerful interventions from people. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think there are some responses to your comments coming in on the chat, Diana, and in a minute I might ask Helen to pick up on one or two of those, but I'll let her digest it, and I'll come to Hilary now. Okay. Oh. Right, Hilary, I think you're on.
Am I through? Yes. I wanted to relate the comment that was made about the FA, the chairman of the FA, and also the comment that the event this evening that has come up on my alerts about a member of the House of Lords referring to Kamala Harris as that Indian. And actually, in a way, as a reassurance to say, to the young woman who's apprehensive about joining tonight's seminar, that actually we're very apprehensive. Because we need help. That the Lord Kilkenny has said that, you know, he has Indian tenants, and he has absolutely classic response to being accused of inappropriateness and racism. And I think my point is that we cannot stay in the white silo in order to resolve the problem and to deal with the shame. We need help from the whole world community to do that, and we need to work together to do that. And so I am just wanted to say thank you to the non-white members of this community who've come and made their contributions, because I really appreciate that.
Okay, thank you. So something of a discussion is opening up about the whole question of white people taking it on themselves, trying to take responsibility for inquiring into this by themselves. I'm coming now, unless Helen, have you picked up on anybody who might kind of join this particular strand of the conversation?
I think it's a very valid question. A very valid.
I'm sorry, I meant Helen Shaw, but do come in, Helen, if you want to.
Well, since I've started, I'll continue. Diana's point is very important, I think, and it's a real question. I suppose for me, I draw on my experience of feminism back in the 60s, 70s, 80s or whatever. I was working in consciousness raising groups and with women and trying to look at how patriarchy had impacted on our lives and what we had internalized about that. And I wanted to do that with other women. There were men's groups around, and I was terribly pleased they were. I wanted men to be talking about their sexism, but I didn't particularly want to hear it. I wanted them to have spaces where they could think about it, take it on, and work with it in spaces which were just men, just as I was working with just women. Of course, if you stayed in those silos, that's hopeless. You also need the conversations between. So there needs to be mixed spaces as well. But I would argue for the two. I wouldn't say one or the other. I think I want a space to talk with other white people about the things I'm actually quite ashamed of that come up in my mind. And I don't think they should have to listen to it, quite honestly. I need to work it through, think about it with other white people who will also be having their own experiences of that. But I also absolutely need to get into conversations, have those discussions, risk, and with Black people too, who I have to say I generally find incredibly generous, amazingly generous actually. You know, the why I'm not talking to white people about race anymore, I completely get. I'm surprised anyone is, but I think those shared spaces are terribly important as well. But I don't think it's an either or.
Okay. Thank you, Helen. So, Helen Shaw, is there anyone else you would think to bring in at this point?
I wouldn't think that. There's a very lively, rich discussion going on around this subject, but also making links to the concept of white fragility. Lots of discussion.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to come now to Annie. Keeps doing this. Right, you're on.
Hello?
Hello.
All right, okay, I can't see me, so I presume you can. I'm a social worker in the Southend area, and I am particularly concerned because we have quite a high white demographic, obviously, and we are increasingly finding young women who have issues with their colour and saying that they, you know, it's something that they're starting to reject. And I guess what we hear people saying, and I'm sure I've been guilty of it myself, is, and it was referred to in Helen's discussions, that we tend to say that that we're all equal, and actually she made the very point that we're not all equal, and that there is a huge division that needs to be overcome. And I think that in terms of training with foster carers, with social workers, our language in that way is so important. When we think it's not, we think we're saying the right things. And I think there's also a huge need to look at people that are going to specialise in working with some of the young people that I work with, because people say that what as well-intentioned things such as that, but actually they're not qualified or trained enough to do the sort of work that needs to be done with those young people. And if anyone in here has got any links to people that do that sort of work, I would be really, really grateful. Obviously, we've got to look and challenge ourselves to find that, but I just think that would be really helpful, because when you're in an area where there is still quite a lot of issues and quite a white majority, getting hold of those resources is really hard.
Okay, thanks very much, Annie. I'm moving now to Rob Neal.
Oh, thanks, Andrew. Thanks for the offer of a question. Thank you, Helen, for that insightful presentation. And I can't help but imagine it will be a much sought after read. It was interesting and it was engaging. Really, a thought that I wanted to weave into the discussion was around language, really, and around recent comments that I guess many of us on this call will have picked up from the House of Commons, rendering, it would at least be an attempt anyway, to render theories that have been relied upon in considering where we are with the discussion on race. I'm talking about critical race theory. I'm talking about terms such as white privilege, anti-racism, inherited advantage, even talking about Black Lives Matter in certain spaces. And I wondered whether or not there was a thought that anybody had about the impact that that will have if those in positions of power are successful at deleting from the lexicon terms that are well established, well researched, academic research that many of us working in this space have not just acknowledged but rely on in putting forward our points of view. So it's really a question about language, the way that language is often dictated through the lens of white fragility, and therefore the terms on which we have these discussions is often restricted rather than expanded. And just to say very quickly, I agree that the way forward has to be about involving in order to evolve, about a coming together of those different cultures. I agree with what I heard Diana saying, but it needs to be on an equitable basis and not with one seemingly lording over the other.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm coming now to Lydia Hartland-Rowe.
Thank you. I suppose I was caught by something in Helen's paper about, I think I'm remembering, the sort of the blankness that children might meet in their parents' eyes or faces when they're looking for help to understand something or to kind of process something about race. And it came to my mind again when Deirdre spoke, which I found very moving. But I suppose I was thinking about I get the idea of silos and the risk of that, but there's also something about the harm that we re-perpetuate when we clumsily start to have these conversations and we don't know how to have them yet. But I was thinking about psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic psychotherapy and psychoanalytic psychotherapy trainings and what we do with the blank faces, with our blank faces when trainees come to us, when students come to us on other courses in this institution. And I think we do get a bit paralyzed, and we don't know that place where the question of whiteness sort of doesn't get thought about in our own minds conveys itself to our students and potentially to our patients. And so I suppose those conversations are so uncomfortable to have, and it's how to not pass that on to our students and our patients when they happen. I suppose I was just thinking about how seriously we have to take the intimacy of those conversations when they happen, and we've got to get better at having them. And I still find them absolutely paralyzing. I can feel my face freeze when I'm faced with something that I don't know how to respond to in the area of race, when I'm talking to one other person.
Okay, thank you very much, Lydia. So I'm moving now to Heidi.
Oh, hi. Just want to say thank you, Helen, for that talk. It was great. And I think a lot of things you touched on, which is really important when talking about whiteness. I think with the Black Lives Matter movement, we saw kind of what we felt was a big change in kind of saying, actually, we need to stop talking about not being racist and start moving towards being anti-racist. I think that was a real big movement in part of this year's Black Lives Matter movement. But also I think more than that is also understanding that when talking about race, we also need to talk about whiteness and what that means, and talk about white supremacy, because ultimately that is the root of where racism comes from. We can't have discussions of race without talking about whiteness. And I think a lot of the time, historically, it's often been Black people sharing their experiences, often quite painful and quite tiring, to try and get people to understand what it means. And often that's often deflected or interpreted in different ways. Sometimes you need to break down a conversation where people don't fully can actually trust white people to talk about these situations and further creates the problem. So I think more just around whiteness is incredibly important to get people to understand the concept of where it's coming from, understand that dealing with racism shouldn't be solely upon those who are oppressed by it or upon them at all, but actually talking about those who benefit from the system of white supremacy, standing where you're white, and ultimately having a freedom from whiteness so that we can actually understand more about humanity. And I think this is really important that we have more talk about whiteness to actually understand where this whole idea of race comes from to begin with. So thank you.
Okay, many thanks. Jeremiah.
Good evening, everyone. First of all, if I kind of like start speaking and just kind of run out of things to say, just bear with me because of my perspective. That's how I kind of like express my thoughts. I just wanted to start by saying this was a really good this really good discussion and presentation, and I felt as though kind of to smile to myself a little bit, because at some aspects it almost felt as though I was watching or reading my own experience in kind of like real time, in a sense, when talking about colorblind and this idea of white silence. I guess for me, especially with the current the way that the Black Lives Matter movement has become a bit more of a mainstream form of outrage at the moment. Something that I've found quite interesting, particularly in with my own experience working and outside, has been somewhere between like white silence, but also the kind of performative nature of white outrage. Not to say that people who are outraged are clearly are just performing, but I found it quite interesting that there were some within my proximity who were clearly outraged by the death of George Floyd, clearly outraged by what was going on, but there didn't seem to be an acknowledgement of your own behavior and how your day-to-day way of living has impacted the people of color around you. And I always found that quite I don't know what to really say about that. Quite interesting, a little bit amusing, but it's still quite dangerous, to be honest. And it goes back to this idea of, I think it ties back to this idea of being colorblind, and this idea of almost, you know, it's almost this dismissive nature of racism. Oh, you know, color doesn't exist, so, you know, it's or I'm colorblind, so this can't be an issue that I'm a part of, and it's almost that denial. I found that yeah, and I think that yeah, I think that's all I kind of really wanted to touch on. I think that something around the white at the beginning was spoken about whiteness when we were talking about the slaves, and whiteness almost becoming a group, and it was becoming reinforced as a way to separate whiteness from like and blackness basically being created as an offshoot of that. I kind of appreciate that from a white lens, in the sense of I can imagine that, you know, white supremacy, those in power at that time maybe reimagined and redefined what blackness looks like to serve that agenda at that particular time. But there's also a part of me that felt that, you know, blackness also existed, predated that in its other many forms. But to hear it in this standpoint was also quite interesting. So yeah, just that's all that I've kind of got to say. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the white performative outrage notion has caught some resonances in the audience. We've got about 10 more minutes of discussion, so I would just again ask people to be succinct. And I'm coming now to Rosalie.
Hi, I will try to be as short as possible. I am a trainee at the Tavistock, and I've been a trainee at Tavistock for the past 5 years. I am very, very interested in psychoanalysis. And I had some time, I have incredible teachers that have given me opportunity to understand a bit more about Freud, about Melanie Klein, and how those psychoanalytical way of thinking seems to struggle to consider the element of race and color within the psychoanalytical concept, and as a Black foreigner individual coming to the Tavistock and training and the learning about all these kind of different things, I feel a little bit scared to actually apply some of my thoughts into my theory. It's just a reflection, because like what I see is, you know, all the stuff that you said, I think it's all very valuable. But one thing that I would like to kind of just finalize it, because you want me to be concise, very short, is, you know, there is no such a thing as a self-made man. So we do need to work together. And I think if we were to look at it from the humanistic point of view, we would be able to make a difference together, because white people or Black people, I cannot do all this thinking on my own. You know, so, you know, but also white people cannot also do all the thinking by themselves. We do need to find a way to work together. But a psychoanalytical concept is already there, but how can we make it, you know, tie it together as a unity point of view? But this is what I would like to share.
Okay, thank you so much. So Nick Benefield, please.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Helen, for, of course, a very good paper. I just wanted to simply say something about the fact that Black Lives Matter, for me, broke a silence. You know, not because I thought I'd been silent about race, but just because it was such a big event, and the sense of so many of us thinking this is so wrong and it's so much more than just one man's life. But I think the thing that comes from this evening, which is really interesting discussion, actually some really new views and things which are good, is this question of fragility and privilege. And it's the idea that if I wanted anything in myself in relation to the next stage of my trying to engage with this better, is in some way I do, as Helen says, I want a dialogue with white people first, not because I don't think we need dialogues together, but somehow the breaking of a silence is the breaking of white silence. And it's that white silence that in my work in prisons and places like that, it's not feeling able to have a conversation that's honest and open in such a way that I'm always confronted with, will I lose my privilege by speaking? You know, will I in some way be undermined? And actually that's huge in white people. That's huge in me. Even though I think I've tried to deal with it, to tackle it, it's big, and it's very big. And I think this is like taking a step back and saying whiteness needs work to be done in a way that we've not perhaps done before in this way. And I do think it's a very important first step from my point of view.
Right, thank you. Thank you, Nick. So Julian Lisardo.
Thank you, and thank you, Helen, for a lovely paper. I was very struck by a phrase that Diana used, people like us. And it occurred to me that we may not like, and indeed perhaps we shouldn't like people like us, because what's uncomfortable about Helen's paper is the work we liberals have to do on our sense of being, likable. And maybe we have to find a place without being consumed by guilt or shame to face the fact that actually aspects of ourselves are indeed unlikable, and it manifests itself in all the things Helen has been talking about, color blindness and collusion and the enjoyment of privilege. So I think the idea that people like us are, if you like, the center of a discussion, maybe we have to approach that discussion with a little less confidence that we are likable. And one other point I wanted to make is that I think there are two issues here. One is our own personal journeys, which the paper invites us to participate in. But the second issue is our anxiety about raising issues of racism in all its manifestations in the institutions of which we are privileged members. And we need to talk about how we work in the group, in the institutional context, as well as how we work on ourselves. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Julian. I'm afraid I can't say your name, but Healing Hands Counselling, please come forward.
Hi, my name's Sasha. I just wanted to say thank you very much. This is a really important conversation. Some of the things that we're talking about is about privilege and how we recognize being in a privileged position, and examining whiteness from maybe a middle class perspective may be different from someone who's working class, and how all of these aspects intersect with one another. And I think that having these discussions are really important, but I do recognize that there is sometimes an internalized racism that I feel within myself to relieve my white colleagues from their discomfort. And I think that that's why it becomes problematic when we start to ask somebody who is of African heritage or of Indian heritage to inform. But we need those voices to come forward and to feel confident and comfortable that they can do that. So I think that I really do appreciate this, this thinking space, and sometimes it can be quite difficult to go inwards and reflect on some of the things that have been shared. But definitely, I think when we think about racism, we also need to kind of start to look at what internalized racism looks like in the fashion of colorism, because that's a lot of maybe my experience within my own family. The lighter people, the darker people, the closer you are to being white, how that shows up in the family dynamics. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to have to disappoint some people in the queue, I fear, but let's keep going until, well, 3 or 4 minutes to 9. So next, please, Monique Davis.
Hi, I was a little bit unsure about coming today as well. So I signed up a while ago, and then when I remembered that it was about whiteness, initially I was thinking, do I actually really need to learn about whiteness? But actually, I think it's so important to shine a light on that. I think so much is put on, on the experience of the oppressed, that what's the other side of the coin. And I think as well, I trained at the Tavistock. I would have finished just over 6 years ago, and my experience as the only Black person on my course was really, really difficult. And I think working with some of the trainees at the Tavistock now, things are changing, but it is refreshing to know that people at the Tavistock are sort of reflecting on this issue and trying to do something, trying to shine some light on this.
Okay, thank you very much. So Sheila Rashid.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Helen, for such an interesting presentation, and to everyone who's spoken. I wanted to follow up from some of the things that Julian said, and I'll be very quick. As someone, as you can see, with lots of grey hair, I am very minded of the death of Stephen Lawrence in 1993, which is my sort of year of growing up. And I remember the profound effect it had on me as an ethnic minority. And actually, I was living in Eltham at that time where he was killed. So it had an extra kind of impact on the lives of our family who did experience racism during that period. And I think it sort of sparked off lots of discussions about institutional racism, as we know, because of the Macpherson report. It sparked off lots of conversations, similar to some of the conversations that we're having actually now, 27 years later. And I suppose there's a bit of me that wants to acknowledge that people are at different stages and processes of these discussions. But there's something about that accountability that, Julian, I think you spoke about, which is the individual, but also the institutional. So throughout these 27 years, I have known about so many reports, so many books that have talked about how change can be brought about in institutions, individuals. But actually, we just get more reports which just perpetuate the notion that things remain unchanged. And I guess in this, I want to ask a question or some reflection about how the Tavistock, 100 years old as it is, has learned so much about these processes. How can the Tavistock talk, and do some thinking about itself as an institution and the individuals in it, to be really honest and think, what have we been doing to perpetuate racism and racist experiences for our staff, for our trainees, in the ways that we see clients, and what can we do differently? What are we going to do things differently? How are we going to go from sort of just talking into action and accountability?
Thank you. I would just say that something like those conversations are active now, much more so than they were 3 or 4 months ago. That's all I would say at this point. There's quite a lot happening, I think, but of course a long way to go. Anne Parsons, you're going to be the last contributor to this discussion before I invite Helen to just say a few words.
Yeah, I was very struck by what Helen was saying, and a number of people have said about the work that's required to release white privilege, and being a white woman and having reflected on whiteness and taught it to students, and being part of a community group where white people, we reflected on it, and just being very grateful this evening to listening to people sharing so deeply, really, and the willingness to work alone, the willingness to work together, and just seeing how many people, I mean, it's not a numbers thing, but what a mixed representation we are this evening. And I just wanted to thank you for putting this on. And I'm really glad I came along, because like some people, I had some misgivings of coming along, and I wondered what my apprehension was, you know, and joining and having a conversation about race, which can be very painful, and wherever we're coming from, I think. And I just want to say thank you.
Well,
and thank you, Helen. Thank you.
Your comments, in a sense, take us back to the start of this conversation, just about to the things that I think Esther was saying very near the beginning. Helen, I'm going to invite you to just make some final observations of your own.
Blimey. Well, I mean, I've just been very moved and impressed by the discussion. I just suppose pick up 2 points. One is around projections. I worry about, well, we're all worried about America, but one of the problems here is we can I think the problem for white liberals is we can project onto the avowed white supremacists so easily our racism, and I think we can do that at the moment onto America and to Trump and his supporters. And I think that's a dangerous place to go. I think what Trump has done is, or that phenomenon has revealed something profound that is really we have to face. In this country, I think William Wilberforce is our hero, as if, you know, what Britain did was end the slave trade. Shortcutting the fact that you know, for 300 years we were the major trader, and that still doesn't really get faced in this country. So I'm just something about the projection onto America at the moment. And then just bringing it back to this idea of our own profession. I'm just talking about psychoanalytic psychotherapy. I'm sure, I know not everyone in the room is, but it is involved in that, which I think particularly picking up with Lydia and Rosalie, and I think Schiller's talked about. I think, and I go into it more in the book, but I think the Freud and Jung, their theories are very, very profoundly based in 19th century armchair anthropologists who were set on proving that Black Africans were at the bottom of the pile and white Europeans were at the top. And, you know, when we think about terms like the primitive, which we go on using without really thinking about it, its roots are appalling. And I think, and I also worry that our own profession is so individualistic based. We constantly make a distinction between inner and outer. I think we've got a particular problem with racism. And I have been around, as Andrew said, in various positions within the psychoanalytic community. And I think there's a huge amount of work that we have to do. Looking at our theories and our institutions and our trainings. The blank face that Lydia talked about, I talk quite a lot in the book about the dead mother, Andre Green's idea, which I know he's using in a different way, but I think that's something about, we keep coming just back to that dead blank space where we don't really take it on. So I think there's something about how are our institutions, how is psychoanalytic psychotherapy really going to not just put up a banner on our website saying we all support Black Lives Matter. That's easy. What's the anti-racist practice that we're really going to engage in to make sure that a lot of people's experience just improves? You know. And I think the last point is, I hope what message is coming across is that it's a lot of work for white people, and it's uncomfortable and difficult. But I hope what really gets across is we benefit. This is not altruistic. We suffer from racism too. This is horrible. This is not a good way to live. And if we really want to change society and get somewhere better, we've got to do that work. So that's my argument.
So thank you, Helen, and thank you for the talk. And as we come to a close, I just want to say that we, putting on this event, were apprehensive too before tonight. And I would like to thank everyone in the audience, and particularly those who contributed, because I think it has been a thoughtful, deep, at times emotional, but very, very kind of measured discussion. And I'm sorry to those people who didn't get a chance to contribute, but really, this is one conversation that I think we hoped would be the sort of origin of many more conversations that flow out of it. That said, because of the popularity of this event, we are going to put it on again, probably in much the same form, but we'll give that thought in January. So you might want to attend again. I think the paper will probably be much the same, but the conversation will probably be different. So with that, you might like to find a way to show your appreciation to Helen. I've seen many, many appreciative comments in the chat. Thank you to everybody once again, and I'm going to say good night.